Hi, Grandma here reading Star of Light. The first chapter, we were introduced to the characters. Hamid, who is a young boy, his sister Rama, who is a young girl, and the baby, whose name is Kinza. They have just discovered that the baby is blind. And the problem with that is they have a new stepfather who will try to hurt the baby or will try to give the baby away. They've taken the baby to a saint's cave, but the baby is still blind. Chapter 2, The Secret Revealed. They reached the village 10 minutes later and passed by the dark huts. Through open doors, glowing charcoal gleamed cheerfully in clay pots, and families squatted around their evening meal by dim lamplight. But as they came near their own house, they could hear the angry voice of Fatima, the older wife, shouting at their mother. Fatima hated the new wife and her 3 children and made life as hard as she could for them in every possible way. She was bent and wrinkled by long years of hard work, and Zora was still young and beautiful. Fatima had longed in vain for a baby, while Zora had had 6. So perhaps it wasn't surprising that the older woman was so jealous and had been so angry at their coming to live in the house. She showed her hatred by sitting cross-legged on the mattress like a queen all day and making Zora and Rama work like slaves. Zora had only escaped to the well because Fatima had fallen asleep, but unfortunately she had not slept for long. Furious at finding the young woman not there, she'd sent a neighbor's child to spy out for her. So Zora, carrying her buckets, had arrived home to find that Fatima knew about her expedition. "Wicked, deceitful, lazy one," shouted Fatima. "You can't deceive me. Give me that child. Let me see for myself why you hide her away and hold her so secretly and creep with her to the tomb. Give her to me, I say. I insist on having her." She snatched the baby roughly from Zora's grasp and carried her to the light, and the mother sighed and let her empty arms fall to her side. After all, Fatima must know soon. They could not hide it much longer, and she'd better find out for herself. The frightened children squatted in the shadows by the wall. Their dark eyes were very big. The hut was silent as Fatima passed her hands over the baby's limbs and stared into Kinza's still face. Hamid, holding his breath, heard little sounds he'd never noticed before. The slow, rhythmical munching of the ox in the stall, the rustle of straw as the kids nuzzled against their mothers, and the soft crooning of roosted hens. Then the silence was broken by a triumphant cackle of laughter from the old woman, and Kinza, whose ears were very sensitive to loud noises and angry voices, gave a frightened cry. Fatima picked her up and almost flung her back into her mother's lap. "Blind," she announced, "blind as night, and you knew all the time. You brought her here to your husband's house to be a burden on all of us forever. Never to work, never to marry. You hid her away in case we found out. Oh, most deceitful of women. Our husband shall know about this tonight. Now, get up and prepare his supper, and you, Rama, fan the charcoal. When he has eaten his food, we shall hear what he has to say." Well, what do you think he's going to say? The frightened little girl jumped up and set to work with the bellows till the flames leaped from the glowing coals and flung strange shadows on the walls. Zora, trembling, laid her baby in the swinging wooden cradle that hung from a beam and set to work to mash the beans and beat in the oil, for her husband had gone to speak to a neighbor and would be home any time now. Supper was just ready when they heard his firm steps coming along the path, and a moment later he appeared in the doorway. A tall man with black eyes and a black beard and a hard, cruel mouth. He wore a long garment made from the dark homespun goat's wool, with a white turban wound around his head. He did not speak to his wives or his stepchildren, but sat cross-legged in front of the low round table and signaled for the food to be set before him. If he noticed Fatima's triumph in the white, scared faces of Zora and the children, he said nothing. Zora set the hot dish in the center of the table, and the silent family gathered around. There were no spoons, but she broke 2 large pieces of bread for her husband and Fatima, and 3 small pieces for herself, Hamid, and Rama. "In the name of God," they murmured as they scooped their bread in the center dish, for they hoped the words would drive away evil spirits that might be lurking around the table. Sometimes at midday, when the sun was shining, Rama forgot to say them, but she never forgot at night, because the flickering shadows and dark corners made her feel afraid. Evil spirits seemed very real and near after the lamps had been lit. And certainly tonight, the little home was filled with evil spirits, dark spirits of jealousy and anger and hatred and cruelty and fear. Even little Kinza in her hanging cradle seemed to feel the atmosphere and wailed fretfully. Si Mohammed frowned. "Stop that noise," he growled. "Pick her up." The mother obeyed and sat down again with her baby held very close against her. Fatima waited a moment until her father had finished eating. Then she held out her arms. "Give that child to me," she said threateningly. Zora handed over her baby and burst into tears. "What's the matter?" said Si Mohammed irritably. His wives may quarrel all they pleased. Wives always did quarrel, but he disliked them doing it in front of him. He had been plowing all day and was tired. "Yes, what indeed is the matter?" sneered Fatima, and she held out the baby at arm's length so that the lamplight suddenly shone straight onto her face. But Kinza neither squinted her eyes nor turned away from it. Si Mohammed stared at her directly. "Blind!" cried Fatima, as she had shouted before. "Blind, blind, blind!" And Zora knew it. She had deceived us all. "I didn't," sobbed Zora, rocking to and fro. "You did," shouted the old woman. "Silence, you women," said their husbands sternly, and the quarrel stopped immediately. Once again there was silence in the dim hut. Rama suddenly felt cold with fear and crept closer to the dying charcoal. Her stepfather looked very closely at Kinza's tiny face, flashed the light in front of it, and jerked his hand toward her face until he was satisfied that the old woman spoke the truth. "Truly," he agreed, "she is blind." But the dreadful outburst of rage never came. He handed Kinza back to her mother, half closed his eyes, and lit a long, thin pipe. He sat puffing away in silence for some time until the hut was filled with sickly fumes, and then he said, "Blind children can be very profitable. Keep that baby carefully. She may bring us much money." "How?" asked Zara nervously, her arms tightening around her baby. "By begging," replied her husband. "Of course we cannot take her begging ourselves, for I am an honorable man. But there are beggars who would be glad to hire her to sit with them in the markets. People feel sorry for blind children and give generously. I believe I know of one who would pay to borrow her when she's a little older." Zora said nothing. She dared not. But Hamid and Rama gave each other a long, rebellious look across the table. They knew the beggar of whom their stepfather spoke, an old man, dressed in filthy old rags, who swore horrible oaths. They did not want their precious Kinza to go to that old man. He would certainly mistreat and frighten her. Their stepfather saw the looks through half-closed eyelids. He clapped his hands sharply. "To bed, you children," he ordered, "quickly." They got up hurriedly, mumbled good night, and scuttled into dark corners of the room. There were low mattresses laid along the wall. Curling themselves up on these, they pulled strips of blanket over them and fell fast asleep. Mohammed never knew why he woke that night, for he usually slept soundly till sunrise. But at about 2 a.m, he suddenly sat up in bed, wide awake. A patch of bright moonlight was shining through the window into Kinza's cradle, and she was moaning and stirring in her sleep. Mohammed slipped from his mattress and stood beside her. Suddenly, a great wave of protective tenderness seemed to come sweeping over him. She was so small, so patient, and so defenseless. Well, he would see to it that no harm came to her. All his life, he would guide her through her darkness and protect her with his love. His heart swelled for a moment, and then he remembered that he was only a boy himself and completely under his stepfather's control. They might take Kinza away from him, and then his love would be powerless to reach her. Was there no stronger love to shelter her, no more certain light to lead her? He did not know. Chapter 3, Si Mohammed Makes a Deal. And you can see the coins. Blind Kinza sat in the doorway of her hut and lifted her small face to the sunshine. It was Thursday, and on Thursday, Kinza went to work. She was 2.5 years old now, and quite old enough, in her stepfather's opinion, to earn her living like the rest of them. She sat still and patient, her weak legs folded under her, her hands clasped quietly in her lap. It was quite early, and Mohammed, who carried her to her job, had taken the cow to pasture and would not be back for a while. In the meantime, she was free to enjoy herself, and Kinza enjoyed herself quite a lot in her own way. As long as the sun shone and the weather was fine, she was on the whole a happy little child. Since she had never seen the light, she could not miss it, and there were many good things to feel. There was the warmth and shelter of her mother's lap, the clasp of her brother's strong arms, and the wet noses of the goat kids when they nuzzled her hands. There was the touch of the sun on her body and the wind on her face. Sometimes she was allowed to sit by her mother as she sorted the corn, and one of Kinza's greatest treats was to pick up hands full of worn husks and let them slip through her fingers. There were lovely things to hear, too, and she knew now that Mohammed was coming toward her from the particular sound of his bare feet on the dry mud. She held up her arms and gave a delighted squeak. Mohammed picked her up and tied her firmly on his back. "Market day, little sister," he announced. "Have you had some breakfast?" Kinza nodded. Half an hour ago, she had drunk a bowl full of sweet black coffee and eaten a hunk of brown bread. It was the best breakfast she knew, and she had really enjoyed it. "Come then," said Mohammed, and they set off together, keeping under the olive trees to begin with, because by 9 o'clock in the summer the sun was blazing hot. But very soon they left the trees behind them, and the path to market ran between wheat fields ripe for harvest, where the air smelled of poppies. The sound of the wind rustling through the corn made her sleepy, and Kinza laid her head on her brother's shoulder and shut her eyes. There were many people on the path that morning, and as they reached the marketplace, the crowds became thicker. It was an area of burnt yellow grass, shaded by eucalyptus trees, and the sellers sat cross-legged on the ground with their goods piled up in front of them, while the buyers tramped around them. Kinza hated it. She hated the jostling and the jolting and the noise, the dust that made her sneeze, the flies that crawled over her face, and the fleas that bit her legs. Most of all, she hated the moment when Mohammed left her in the care of the old beggar. But Mohammed, to make it easier for her, had worked out a plan. During the week, he tried to beg, borrow, or steal a small coin. He would exchange it in the market on Thursday morning for a lump of sticky green candy covered with nuts. Licking that candy was the best treat Kinza knew. Mohammed knew the marketplace very well and made his way to the patch of sand where Kinza and the beggar sat side by side. He made sure he got there before the beggar to give him time to settle Kinza and let her eat the green candy. Mohammed took a few secret licks himself first and then handed it over warm and wet to his sister. She clasped it in her right hand, loving its sweet stickiness, and began to lick it all over, going round and round it with the tip of her little pink tongue. In her left hand, she held tightly to the hem of Mohammed's tunic, in case the roaring crowd should pull him away from her. They had not been there long before the old beggar came shuffling toward them with a colored drum in his hand. He was amazingly dirty and old, and his patch coat was falling to pieces. Mohammed kissed his hand politely and received the coin that was paid to his stepfather each week for the loan of Kinza. But instead of dismissing him crossly as he usually did, the old beggar spoke to him. "When your father comes down to buy," he growled, "tell him I have business with him." Mohammed nodded, freed himself gently from Kinza's grasp, and ran off. Kinza, finding herself left alone, started to cry until the old beggar noticed and slapped her for it. Her work was not very difficult during the early part of the day. All she had to do was sit with her small face lifted to the light so that everyone could see she was blind, and hold out her hand. The old beggar sat beside her, thumping his drum to make people look at her, and chanting and swaying. Many people felt sorry for the tiny white-faced child and gave her coins, which she handed to her master. So they sat until noon, and the sun rose higher, and the dust and the flies grew thicker. The crowds wandered around them, and the stray dogs sniffed them. Sometimes people tripped right over her. At noon, Kinza's master gave her a piece of dark rye bread and a cup of water. And because she'd collected quite a lot of money during the morning, he gave her a squashed plum. It was delicious. She sucked all her 10 fingers in turn so that she didn't lose one drop of juice. The afternoon was harder than the morning, for by 2 o'clock, Kinza began to grow sleepy. Her dark head, tied up in its cotton cloth, began to nod heavily, and her eyes would not stay open. She longed for her mother's lap, but all she could do was lean against the old man's rags to rest her weary head. But only for a few minutes. He saw what had happened and angrily jerked her upright. Feeling dazed, she rubbed her knuckles in her eyes, stretched herself, and tumbled forward. Once again, he jerked her back, slapped her, and propped her up again. So with her outstretched hands supported by the other, she sat begging, half asleep, until the beggar suddenly got up and she fell over sideways. He sat up and with an impatient bump, "Bad child," he growled. "Sit and beg till I come back." He'd got up because on the outskirt of the crowd he'd seen the tall figure of Kinza's stepfather looking about for him. The farmer would not wish to speak to the beggar in the open market, so they met behind a huge eucalyptus tree and stood talking. "You wanted me?" asked the farmer. "Yes," said the old beggar. "I'm leaving the village. The country people are growing greedy and are giving less to honorable beggars. So I'm going to the big town on the coast with my wife. The great feast will soon be here, and they say beggars grow rich in the streets of the town. Now this is what I want to say. Give me that blind child of yours. You are not a beggar, and you can never make use of her, but she makes a lot of money for me. My wife will look after her, and I will pay you a good sum for her." Kinza's stepfather hesitated. He knew that he was plotting a very wicked thing, but he needed money badly. His cow had strayed into a neighbor's cornfield and had been put in cow's prison. He had to pay a lot of money to get it back again. His harvest was poor this year, and Kinza, while she earned a little, was and always would be an extra mouth to feed. Si Mohammed refused to listen to his conscience. After all, Kinza was not his child. Mohammed was 11, almost a man, and could soon be left to earn his own living. And Rama could be married off in 3 or 4 years, but this may be the first and last chance you would ever have of getting rid of Kinza. "How much will you give me?" he said at last. The beggar mentioned a small sum. The farmer said that was not nearly enough. The beggar shouted back, and they bargained angrily for some time. Nobody took much notice, for that is the way prices are fixed in that country. They finally agreed on a price that was exactly halfway between what both had asked in the first place. "Right," said the beggar at last. "I'll be leaving the village at dawn on the first day of the week. When you hand over the child, I will hand over the money, and it shall be done in the presence of witnesses." Though neither showed it, both were pleased. The old beggar fought his way back to Kinza, hoping she'd managed to collect some coins while he'd been away. But she'd done nothing of the sort. She crept into a patch of shade and lay fast asleep, curled up in a ball like a tired kitten. I mean, she's only 2 years old. Of course she's taking a nap. Well, that doesn't sound very good for Kinza, does it? But we've got a lot more of the book to read, so there's hope. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.